Hello, honeys, and happy November. Hope your month is starting off perfectly well here. I know I'm excited for the end of month Thanksgiving travels I have planned to see my family. But long before we get to that, we have, of course, our first full-length episode for the month. We are talking today in great depth about Velazquez's masterpiece, Las Meninas, the who, what, when, how, and why it matters behind this painting. Our investigation will take us partially into what it was really like in the courts for an artist, for a court painter. And of course, most specifically, we'll be talking the Spanish 16th century court setting for this artist. And with no further introduction needed, here we go, honeys, Las Meninas and court painting. Our story today will begin with a short summary of Diego Velazquez's biography. He was born in 1599 in Seville. Barnaby's notes that this, then, was the center of Spain's maritime trade. Seville was the cultural capital of the kingdom. It thrived with the nation's overseas colonies. Not only was he lucky to be born in this place and time, relatively, his family was wealthy and prominent, with his father being a lawyer and his mom's family being lower Spanish nobility. The apprenticeships that he obtained in his youth were pretty impressive. He worked with the head of the Painters Guild of Seville, one Francisco Herrera, starting at age 9. Only a year later, at age 10, he began working also with prominent art theorist Francisco Pacheco del Rio. In his early career, his youth, you might say, he showed a focus on painting religious subjects and scenes of daily life in Seville. Some of these early works, like An Old Woman Cooking Eggs or The Water Cellar of Seville, are considered evidence of an already admirable technique by art historian experts. Says the National Gallery of Art, quote, "The shorthand of Velazquez's brushwork mimics the effect of light and color with extraordinary realism. His free and fluid style, a legacy of the Venetian Renaissance, influenced Manet and the first masters of modern art," end quote. Especially with the production of this sort of artwork, Velazquez seemed at first to align with his mentors' beliefs that the purpose of art was to, quote, inspire people to adore and love God and cultivate piety, according to our sources. Yet we see Velazquez steadily shifting away from this, focusing instead on individualism in art and depicting people across all, especially ordinary, walks of life. Also, at some point during these teenage years, he met his future wife, Juana, through Pacheco del Rio. Juana was his mentor's daughter, and the couple would go on to have 2 girls. Now let's zoom out for a moment and look at the contexts into which Velazquez enters court painting, the times in which he was living beyond Seville. First and foremost, this is the time of the Spanish Baroque, a new, more intense kind of realism. It had a few pretty clear objectives. First, easy reading, allowing the viewer to easily understand the scenes depicted. This was often done through the uses of realism, severity, and sometimes even gore to make sure the point got across. The Spanish Baroque also had a pretty recognizably severe aesthetic style. Some of its characteristics include tenebrism, aka the emphasis on Caravaggio-like naturalism and theatrical dramatic lighting. We also see some Flemish influence in loose brushstrokes and broken contours. Maybe the most compelling feature, Spanish Baroque showed this real dynamism, this sense of potential or actual movement. One of the Spanish Baroque's longer-term impacts, in fact, is affecting the sort of definition of the Spanish still life to include this sort of illumination along with hard lines and simple geometric compositions. Yet, according to the National Gallery of Art, the Spanish Baroque was also aiming to meet the Catholic Church's demands for decorum during the Counter-Reformation, which was happening right about then, to revitalize the Catholic Church and counteract Protestantism through visual art propaganda. They write, quote, "Painters and sculptors attempted to make images of Christ, the Virgin, and saints as convincing and accessible as possible. This realism was intended to shock the senses and stir the soul," end quote. And here's a good conversation starter, a did you know for this upcoming holiday party season. When it comes to the Spanish Baroque, the painters of this period, especially Velazquez and Francisco de Zurbarán, the sculptors, examples given by the NGA include Juan Martínez Montañez and Pedro de Mena, are still largely unknown outside of Spain despite the skill behind and quality of the works they produced. All this despite the fact that during the period, sculptors worked very closely with the painters. They taught the painters their methods of polychroming, or painting many colors onto a sculpture, as part of a painter's broader training. This collaboration, in expert opinion, led to this new style of painting that was very vividly naturalistic, that emphasized 3D illusions. But back to our main point, we see a lot of support for the Catholic Church's messaging during this time being made through Spanish Baroque art, partially because the main buyers of it were the Catholic Church and institutions linked to it. With this being the case, I could see how one might think the Spanish Baroque artists were sellouts. But remember that these commissions still came with income, with opportunities for social prestige and public exhibition, and maybe even other patrons. All said and done, though, the Spanish Baroque is considered very fatalist, gloomy, and skeptical on the whole. There are a few things to keep in mind as well when it comes to the general context of the nation of Spain, its economy and politics at this time. The Kingdom of Spain's wealth peaked in the 1500s because treasure was constantly being brought back from their American colonies. This led to the golden age of Spanish painting in the 1600s, even as general wealth was starting to decline with the loss of these colonies and an uptick in local European wars. The flourishing of literature and art as a result of this international exploration and buzz of new ideas is really why it's considered the golden age, despite that decline of wealth. We also see an important shift in political powers at this time. Madrid becomes the center of the Spanish court by the 1600s, yet Seville continues to remain the country's most important economic center for a while after that. Overall, throughout the 1600s, and especially the reign of Philip IV, we see a decline of the Spanish Empire and a whole bunch of other troubles. And really, these troubles start for the court of Philip IV before Velazquez even gets there. Philip IV's first wife, Elizabeth of France, died in 1644, and their son together passed 2 years afterwards. Lacking both a queen and an heir, Philip IV remarried, this time to Mariana of Austria, in 1649, and their daughter together, Margaret Teresa, is the princess seen in today's painting. All the same, the palace was low-key an art lover's dream. Under the supervision of his prime minister, Count Duke Olivares, it was built between 1633 and 40. It was decorated with works by the greatest artists of the time, which would later include Velazquez and Zurbarán, from various European nations. And one final bit of context before we bring Velazquez back into the picture: Spanish court painting and the status of court painters leading up to the time. The artists were very undervalued. Their work was considered as craft, whereas poetry and music were considered finer arts. The painters themselves rarely had much status, much weight to throw around. So now, finally, is Velazquez as a court painter. Today's sources differed on exactly which year he arrived in Madrid, but it was either 1622 or 1623. Diego and his father-in-law then presented themselves at court. Now we know for sure in 1623, Velazquez paints an impressive enough portrait of the king for it to be submitted to a competition. The prize of that competition? Becoming a member of the court portrait painting staff, which he did after winning the competition in 1627. The royals then financed the move of his young family to Madrid. The Met notes what a big deal it was to gain this position in and of itself. As a court painter, Velazquez's formal portraits were most importantly serving as the official images circulated throughout Europe and the Americas of the royal family. He was expected to cover not only those family members, but also court members, nobility, numerous court jesters, equestrians, just about anyone he was asked to. As he was doing so, Velazquez continued to earn recognition for his talent and his skill, his craft, and so he was almost constantly rising in the ranks. In fact, he earns so much acclaim and trust that after a couple years, he begins travels to Italy to make copies of famous works to send back to the Spanish court. His first trip in 1629 is notable because it allowed him the chance to create ahead of their time landscape pieces. Until this point in history, honeys, landscapes without any overlaying religious narratives or other grander perspectives basically didn't exist. They weren't considered worthy of depicting. Yet Velazquez's representations of the Via Medici gardens have an unusual focus on capturing a fleeting moment, on ephemerality. Velazquez also composed them on the spot, aka in plein air before plein air. The years pass and are fairly good to Velazquez, and then we hit the 1640s and 50s. At this point, Diego is both the court painter and the curator of Philip IV's expanding collections of European art. Velazquez continues to enjoy unusual levels of freedom in the role. He travels again to Italy and supervises the decoration and interior design of palace rooms. He's responsible for the sourcing, attribution, hanging, and inventory of many of the Spanish king's paintings, statues, and tapestries. Barnaby's points out that in that second trip, 1648 to 51, Velazquez made purchases for the Royal Art Collection and was accepted into the Accademia di San Luca in Rome, which was a big honor at that time. Medium magazine also tells us that in 1650, Velazquez was commissioned to paint the portrait of Pope Innocent X. The selection showed an unusual recognition for Spanish painting and painters, and was considered an even greater honor because it basically came at the expense of Italian artists during a time when nationalism was still pretty strong. They go on to write that the commission was also notable because, quote, while the Pope was known as a mean-spirited person by many of his detractors, Velazquez's psychological portrait offers a more complex perspective of a person who simultaneously comes across as serious, curious, and suspicious, end quote. So we're seeing Velazquez start to be recognized and respected in Spain as a connoisseur. We're seeing Velazquez continue to grow his prestige, and along with it, the prestige, the status, the meaning of court painting and court painters. Velazquez's last years at the Spanish court were also the last of his life. They were filled with royal commissions and honors, though. For example, Philip IV was not necessarily the best sitter. He resisted often being portrayed in his old age, yet he still allowed Velazquez to include him in Las Meninas. The king would often sit and watch the artist work, and they seem to have had a generally close relationship, as Philip was a serious patron and collector of the arts. They seem to have really aligned on that. Even the king basically had a soft spot when it came to Velazquez's representations. In 1652, Velazquez was appointed court marshal. This post brought him status and material rewards, but the duties weighed heavily on his time, so the remaining 8 years of his life did see, compared to his earlier years, fewer works produced, mainly royal family portraits. Which leads us right to 1656 when he painted Las Meninas. By this time, he had been with the Spanish court and therefore Philip IV's household for 33 years. Then in 1658, Velazquez is knighted as a member of the Order of Santiago. His efforts to be admitted were partially in pursuit of the broader artist push at this point for societal recognition of painting as a liberal art. Its designation as mechanical art was a point of controversy at the time. Prior to this, the Order of Santiago had excluded those whose occupations were mechanical, so with Velazquez's induction came the recognition that Spanish painters were looking for, and from one of the highest institutions, no less. And finally, honeys, let's talk about the artwork itself, Las Meninas, dated 1656. We have to start somewhere, so we'll start with the fact that we have pentimenti here. Infrared light exams show traces of alterations like the tilt of the artist's figure's head. We also see a strategic use of visible versus invisible paint strokes. In one example of visible strokes, we see white streaks down the sleeves of the Infanta, the princess herself, as well as the attendants and Velazquez. This draws our eye back to the palette held by the artist figure and reminds us of the meta action occurring here in this painting about a painting. The work is also technically a bodegon. Although the Dallas Art Museum says that the term today is most often associated with still life scenes of food and kitchen utensils or other household objects, as well as artistic representations of tavern and street corner scenes, the concept was much broader in 17th century Spanish painting. At that point in time, a bodegon was a pictorial composition in which the subject matter is an arrangement of objects. That is certainly true here. We have an arrangement of people and objects. The associations with food stick around likely because of the term's origins in that of bodega, which means tavern in Spanish. Velazquez's long interest in this sort of representation of arrays of people and objects is kind of evidenced by the works of his youth, which depict regular people struggling through their everyday tasks. The development of the bodegon in Spain began in the city of Toledo, likely because naturalistic painting long dominated the local artistic scene between the 1560s and 1630s, so definitely before Velazquez. Yet the artist had his own relationship with it as well. Today's sources say he, quote, popularized the bodegon in the broad sense of the term, and his skill for this genre of painting was recognized by his master, Francisco Pacheco, as well as by many subsequent scholars, end quote. The reason we're taking so much time to focus on the bodegon and the fact that this painting is one is because we pick up on this sort of objectification of the figures as if they are food items or daily scene components. Even we as art historians feel weird calling this a portrait because portraits are so much more often focused on the internality, the person behind the face. Here we do not see that same level of intimacy, of personal connection, and of reference to the sitter's psychological inner worlds. Furthermore, all of the formal royal portraits on the background walls in this work give us inherent contradictions to what we see by providing examples of the more portrait-style approach to these same figures. We see two different representations of the same people at once. Because this painting is so difficult to classify in that sense, we could also make an argument for it being a genre painting. It is informal, like a genre painting would be, and it gives us a look into the day in the life of a given person. In this case, a look at the day in the life of a court painter's studio. Even deeper than the question of exactly what sort of painting are we looking at here runs the question of perspectives, the creation of spaces. Art historians, as a collective, still cannot agree what in the heck is going on here, honeys, and that makes this painting kind of legendary. We know for sure that the work is set in the Piazza Principale, or the main room of that late son's living quarters. After he had passed away about a decade before this work was created, the rooms had become the Palace Museum and then the artist's studio. Yet, as I said, the setting is the only thing we know for sure. Yet the debates and confusion over what is happening here boils down to two main questions. The first question is, through whose eyes are we looking? Whose shoes are we standing in here as we meet the gaze of this whole group that's turned to look at us? Are we meant to be the king? Somebody else? And perhaps even more on the meta side, what painting is Velazquez working on in this image? Will the final result of that work be Las Meninas itself? Or is he working on something else that he produced in the 1650s? Basically, what the hell is on this canvas that is turned away from us? And here, honeys, is where I try to answer those questions as best as I possibly can. Let's take this piece by piece. Velazquez convincingly creates the sense of depth in this large three-dimensional room. He features technical skills of his by showing lots of detail, including other paintings. Yet the work is somewhat unbelievable in the figures' arrangement. If Velazquez were painting the Infanta or others in her group, why are they all in a half-moon shape, mostly behind the artist? How come all are arranged to be in perfect view of the doorway, none blocking the others' faces from that perspective? Why are all of these characters looking out at a viewer? That back wall especially is considered the main visual puzzle of the painting. It features in one spot a mirror, and we know that it is a mirror because it has beveled edges. It's shown as reflective with the image of the Spanish king and queen in it, yet no one agrees on where this reflection comes from. Velazquez never created a standalone work which matches the reflected mirror image of the Spanish king and queen. So no one really knows where this reflection comes from and why it's there. As an explanation, some art historians suggest the viewer must be the king and queen, looking into the mirror and seeing their own reflection. Others suggest that the mirror captures the image of the work in progress that's on Velazquez's figure's canvas. That's why we see a king and queen without seeing a king and queen. Still, others suggest it's a combination of those two facts. Maybe the mirror does reflect the corporeal king and queen, but it's because they're sitting for a work in progress, the one Velazquez is doing. Though the idea of a reflected work in progress is compelling, I will say, honeys, my opinion is that we are looking out through the king and queen's eyes, and that is why they're reflected in the mirror, and that's also why we see the Infanta and her crew looking our way. Of course, the child is going to look to the mom and dad and want their attention. Las Meninas is considered a masterpiece on interrupted action, on gazes and perspectives, tying back to the interpersonal relationships of these various court members. In order to get closer to the meaning of this work, therefore, we're going to take a second to look at these interpersonal relationships represented. Let's talk about the significance of each figure, how they play into the court hierarchies and relations. The highest of the high, of course, is the king. So one widely accepted interpretation is that the group's attention on or gaze towards our viewer position is a substitute for their attention on or gaze towards the king, their ruler, as the one who would be the viewer of this final piece for the foreseeable future. They are looking at him and deferring to him as they should be. We also have the Infanta Margarita herself. She is, in a sense, the star of the piece. She falls at exactly the center of it. She wears standout white clothing, though in the image she's only 5 years old. She's clearly a focal point of the image as one of the most important people in the court. As for why she and her attendants are here, some experts believe that the narrative of this piece is that she has brought her small court to come visit her parents who are having their portraits painted. This makes some sense with the door open behind the group, yet the arrangement of this group references the most intimate, quote-unquote, family that the sovereigns have all in one painting, and each figure tells us something a little different about those relations. We have the Infanta's maid-in-waiting, Maria Augustina Sarmiento, offering her something to drink. This aligns, of course, with Sarmiento's subservient caregiver role. We have another menina, or young girl, Isabella de Velasco, who gives her a friendly look, potentially signifying good political relations, maybe friendliness between families in the courts, something along those lines. We see two people of short stature with her as well, the German Mara Barbola and the Italian Nicolasilo Portesanto. The two have been included possibly as a reference to the realities of jesters and other people as a fact of court life. There are also two guardadamas conversing nearby. This is maybe referencing the security realities of royals and their trust in these security details. Finally, aside from the figure of the artist himself, who we'll get to in a minute, we see Dr. Jose Nieto Velazquez, a relation of the painter, posing in the background facing the door. This may be a reference to Velazquez's family coming up further in the world via his court prominence. So we are seeing a lot of the internal lives of the royals referenced, but we're not seeing a lot of recognition of their internal personalities. And that's where the portrait question still hinges for us, honeys. And last but not least, the artist himself and the way he looks out to the viewer. Art historians, by and large, agree that the painting or the artist's feature in it is meant to, in part, promote himself, to show his importance and value to the court as he is now first painter to the king. This is the argument, in fact, of two particularly standout art historians. First, John Manship White, and also Svetlana Alpers. White makes the point that the artist placed his only confirmed self-portrait, this feature here, in a room in the royal palace surrounded by an assembly of royalty, courtiers, fine objects, in order to represent his life at court, to emphasize his close relationship to it all, and especially to them. In that way, White says, this painting is a summary of the whole of Velazquez's life, his art and career to this point in 1656. Alpers agrees and says that portraying himself at work in the company of royalty and nobility allowed Velazquez to claim high status for both the artist and his art, to show that painting is a liberal art more than a mechanical one. Alpers is among many art historians to suggest that the painting is a way for Velazquez to show that he was, quote, neither a craftsman or a tradesman, but an official of the court, end quote, and prove himself worthy of royal family acceptance. And one final thing to consider about the figures of both the Infanta and Velazquez. While most of the faces in this painting are not clearly defined and the gaze directions vary, both the Infanta and Velazquez clearly meet our eyes as fellow observers and or witnesses of this social gathering. This allows us to feel in tune with each other and shows a sense of mentorship, maybe kindred relations Velazquez felt for the Infanta or for the royal family at large. Las Meninas additionally references other works by Velazquez and motifs he used across his career. For example, it references his Rockaby Venus, aka the sole surviving nude of his. Created between 1648 and 51, this is another piece where Velazquez blurs out the face of the main character and makes it only visible in a mirror reflection. That blurred reflected combination is considered extra off-putting because the angle of the mirror in this piece suggests that she's using it to look at us, the viewers, not at herself. Just like in Las Meninas, questions of gazes and faces dominate here. The 1656 piece also ties to Las Hilanderas, which is dated only a year afterwards. The later artwork shows two different scenes from the Ovid at once, one in quote-unquote real time, in contemporary dress in the foreground. The other occurs within a tapestry on the room's back wall with the figures there in antique dress. We once again have artworks within artworks and multiple stories or narratives referenced at once in a painting by Velazquez. And we're going to step away from the art for a minute here because we're now in 1657 and therefore in the last 3 years of Velazquez's life. He passed away after an attack of fever on August 6th of 1660 in Madrid. And that means it's time to start talking legacies. First, of course, of the artist himself. Velazquez worked his way up through the ranks of the court of Philip IV and made court painting and court painters matter. He earned himself and his colleagues unprecedented recognition, status, and more through the work he did, the relationships he built, and the accomplishments he mastered. Across his life, Velazquez produced very important, notable works. For example, we have Christ in the House of Martha and Mary from 1618, the first instance of painting within a painting that led up to Las Meninas. We have the Surrender of Brida from 1635, Apollo in the Forge of Vulcan from 1630, the Venus work that we mentioned earlier, which also caught the attention of the Spanish Inquisition, I should say, and Portrait of Sebastian de Mora from 1645, which, according to our sources, quote, indicate that he takes his responsibilities seriously as a jester, and he is proud to be serving in the royal household, end quote. In part because of Velazquez, general artist prestige would only continue to improve over the next few centuries. Say our sources, quote, many studies on art theory from this period not only provided biographical information about the artists, but also represented an effort to bring more dignity to the profession, end quote. That being said, these demeaning views and judgmentalism towards painters would only be really overcome in the 18th century. And the legacy of the artwork itself of Las Meninas. The piece is considered to be the height of his inventive originality, even within restrictions he was facing by being a court painter. It's celebrated as a pretty one-of-a-kind and almost unprecedented work. It's celebrated for its overturning, not only modifying, of traditional convention. Though its legacy has not always been so spotless, the work has seen damage, conservation, and eventually even a controversial restoration project. Let's get into it. Some of the damage over the years includes the cutting down of both the left and right sides. The piece was also damaged in the 1734 fire, which destroyed the Alcazar, and was restored not long after by court painter Juan Garcia de Miranda, who almost completely repainted the left cheek of the Infanta to compensate for substantial loss of pigment. Las Meninas was moved to Valencia and later Geneva during the Spanish Civil War. It got scratched up a bit during these relocations. And of course, time has taken its toll. Exposure to pollution and crowds of visitors in recent years has led to a general loss of texture and hue in the work. Now, what about this controversial restoration? Las Meninas was last cleaned in 1984 under the supervision of the American conservator John Brealey, who aimed to remove a so-called yellow veil of dust that had gathered on it since the previous 19th century restoration. According to Spanish publication El País, after a conversation between then Prime Minister of Spain Felipe González and Javier Solana, who was the culture minister at the time, permission was granted for this project. El País says it occurred at the Met because they had the contemporary restoration and conservation facilities necessary for the work, which cost $5,400 US at the time. A small fascinating note on that, and proof of why arts donorship matters, the funds came from a donation of 3 million pesetas, or about $19,600, which had been made for Prado's investments in restoration projects. The Spanish state did not actually monetarily contribute anything. Once it was at the Met, Brealey performed a general cleaning, meaning, unlike some restorers do, he did not divide the painting into areas before starting with the main point of light on the right side. He just went ahead and began. This fact is important because, say our sources, quote, the method marked the way in which many paintings in the Prado have been cleaned since then, end quote. Also important to note that then deputy director of the Prado gave the final okays on this conservation work, knowing that was how Brealey was going to do it. Yet, says the art historian Federico Ziri, this cleaning provoked, almost from the get-go, a ton of protests, quote, not because the picture had been damaged in any way, but because it looked different, end quote. I mean, yeah, that's what happens when you clean something. In any case, here is the account by El País of the rather dramatic start of these protests. A professor of fine arts comes into the Met one day with a group of students and demands to see the painting in the restoration process. They don't care that it's in progress. Once they do, this professor begins literally screaming to stop the restoration because the group made claims they had seen Brealey lifting layers of paint. They said they'd seen color in the cotton swabs with which the restorer worked. It was really the dust Brealey was trying to remove. Understandably, the conservator was so scared by this, he worried that they were going to attack him. Brealey stopped his work for the day and left through a side door. Unfortunately, it only got worse as he continued. Say our sources, quote, the Spanish press criticized Brealey at every opportunity, arguing that only someone born and raised in Spain could truly comprehend and be allowed to handle such an iconic piece of their culture. However, in the opinion of López Rey, the restoration was impeccable, unquote. López Rey was the director of the Prado I previously mentioned. So really, honeys, the drama of all of this was a sad case of extreme cultural bias with over-the-top reactions despite the perfectly well done and to-code work done on the piece. This is a bit of a shameful moment for us in art history. Not only does it sometimes hit the headlines, but Las Meninas lives on in other ways as well. A number of famous other artworks have been inspired by it or by the techniques Velazquez uses here. Our first example, another huge name of Spanish art, Francisco Goya. He etched a print of Las Meninas in 1778. Goya also used it as a model for his work, Charles IV of Spain and His Family. In Goya's work, the royal family is apparently visiting the artist's studio while he's working on a canvas of which only the rear is visible. So almost the exact same concept as Las Meninas. The main difference is the tone of the work in relation to the private versus public setting. Goya's presentation of the royals has a sense of taking place on a stage. It shows him grimly smiling in the sort of wings, giving this sense of imminent suffocation, of cavernous space, of judgment for the royals, instead of the more atmospheric, personal, warm perspective of Las Meninas. Another name you may recognize, more specifically from our Beauty Scandals episode, John Singer Sargent painted an 1879 small-scale copy of Las Meninas. His 1882 painting, The Daughters of Edward Darley Bolt, is also widely considered an homage to Velazquez's work. For the structure of his portrait, The Royal Family at Buckingham Palace of 1913, Sir John Lavery looked to and borrowed from Las Meninas. And then we even have an actual effing play called Las Meninas. Says the Guggenheim, it was created by Leonid Massin with music by Gabriel Fauré and costumes by José María Sert. This version of Las Meninas premiered at the Serge Diaghilev Ballet Russe in Rome in 1916, where Picasso would meet his future first wife, Russian ballerina Olga Koklova. And I bring up that little meet-cute not only as an interesting historical fact, but also because it leads us into Picasso's Las Meninas fixation of 1957. The former's connection to Velazquez began as early as 1895 and recurred throughout Picasso's career. He especially had an ongoing relationship with Las Meninas. Picasso had first seen it as an adolescent at the Prado and used it as a model for copying depictions of jesters and people of short stature. The context and making of this series shows both how serious Picasso was about the project and about his broader career themes at this time. In the mid-1950s and even the early 60s, Picasso worked on several historical series inspired by past greats. These are considered in art history as an effort to perhaps ensure his undeniable place in the canon, therefore on the record. Picasso converted his French home in Cannes into a studio, then from August through December of 1957, worked on and made 58 large canvases in near isolation. 44 of the 58 were directly inspired by Las Meninas, some had different variations. Let's do a breakdown of one of these many Las Meninas interpretations owned by the Guggenheim. Out of the series, it most closely follows Velázquez's vertical composition, whereas some of Picasso's are horizontal. The first includes all original figures playing the same roles and occupying very similar positions, but Picasso makes some changes. For example, Picasso utilizes a black-white-gray color palette to investigate and play with the complex spatial structures of the original. By slightly changing the grouping of the figures, Picasso has a noticeable effect on the spatial organization, making the room feel much more cramped. Picasso also enlarges the figure of Velázquez and has him holding two palettes rather than one, maybe to emphasize and celebrate the artist as a creator. Picasso also chose in this work to increase the intensity of the incoming light and replaces the seated mastiff in Velázquez's original with Picasso's own dog, Lum. The Picasso Museum of Barcelona stresses that context is necessary to understand the lighting changes here. The works that were coming out of Picasso's newly renovated studio with its now many large windows share an emphasis on light and color of the Mediterranean. So it's fascinating to see these real differences in the appearance of artworks based on the geographical location of the artists making them. Picasso donated the series in its entirety in 1968 to the Museo Picasso of Barcelona in memory of a great friend who had recently died. And our final and most recent, inspired by Las Meninas artwork, the high-definition video tableau 89 Seconds at Alcazar, filmed by video artist Yves Sussman in 2004. Inspired by Las Meninas, it is meant to recreate the immediate leading up to and immediate afterwards of Velázquez's frozen time moment when this ensemble all comes together. Because of all of the artworks and debates that it has inspired, all of the content it has provided us with to think over the years, Las Meninas remains one of art history's favorite paintings. I'm very grateful you've all joined me on this journey into Velázquez's famous work, into his life and his role as a court painter in Spanish King Philip IV's world. I hope you're able to walk away from this with a better sense of what court painting was, what court painters did, and the artistic scene in the 16th and 17th centuries. We will be back soon enough with more for you, honeys, but in the meantime, as always, hydrate or dihydrate and take care. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugnote. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.